Carl Jung, you are lying in bed right now, or you will be soon. The lights are off, or almost off. The day is technically over, and somewhere in the transition between the last thing you did and the moment sleep finally arrives, your mind is doing something you have never been fully taught to pay attention to. Something that Carl Jung believed was more consequential for the shape of your life than almost anything you do during the hours when you are awake and in control. Most people treat the minutes before sleep as the absence of the day. The part where nothing is happening, where the mind winds down, the body relaxes, and consciousness simply waits for sleep to arrive. But Jung understood something about this transition that changes everything once you truly grasp it. Those minutes are not the absence of the day. They are its continuation, in a form that is quieter, less visible, and far more influential over who you will be tomorrow than anything you consciously planned or decided while you were busy being awake. What you carry into sleep does not disappear when you close your eyes. It sinks into the layer of mind that operates without your oversight, into the place where habits are formed, where fears are maintained, where the background image of who you are and what you are capable of is quietly reinforced night after night after night. And if that background image has never been examined, if what you are carrying into sleep has never been brought into the light of conscious awareness, then something Jung considered one of the most important insights of his entire life's work applies directly to you. Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate. This is not a philosophical statement. It is a description of exactly what is happening in the minutes before you fall asleep. And this video is about what changes when you finally begin to pay attention to it. To understand why the moments before sleep matter as much as Jung believed they did, you have to understand something about the structure of the mind that most people never encounter in the ordinary course of their lives. During the day, you are primarily running on what Jung called the ego. The ego is not the villain that popular psychology sometimes makes it out to be. It is a functional structure, the part of the mind that allows you to operate in the world with some degree of coherence and predictability. It organizes your experience. It manages your social presentation. It decides what is appropriate to feel, what is acceptable to express, what can be acknowledged, and what needs to be set aside in order to get through the day without falling apart. And it does this work continuously, below the level of conscious awareness, filtering the continuous stream of inner experience and presenting to consciousness only what it has determined is manageable. The rest, the feelings that are too difficult, the thoughts that are too threatening, the desires that do not fit the image you maintain of yourself, the grief that would be too consuming to feel fully while you still have things to do, all of this is held back. Not eliminated, held back. Stored somewhere below the organized surface of daily functioning. Jung called this stored material the unconscious, and he was careful to explain what the unconscious is not. It is not a dark or malevolent region of the mind. It is not the repository of everything shameful or wrong about a person. It is simply the collection of everything that could not be consciously processed and integrated at the moment it arose. Everything the ego decided, for whatever reason, protection, social necessity, simple lack of time or capacity, needed to wait. The problem Jung identified was not that this storage system exists. Every human being needs it. The problem is what happens when the material stored there never gets retrieved, when the waiting becomes indefinite, when the things that were supposed to be processed later accumulate across days, months, years, growing in the dark, influencing the way you feel and react and choose without your knowing that the influence is coming from somewhere specific, from something real, from material that has a history and a shape and a reason for being there. This is what happens to most people, not because they are avoiding it consciously, because the day never provides a natural moment for the retrieval to occur. There is always something else demanding attention, always another task, another conversation, another obligation pulling awareness toward the external world. And so the accumulated material waits. And while it waits, it does not remain inert. It shapes things. The specific emotional color of your mornings. The irrational intensity of reactions that seem out of proportion to what triggered them. The recurring patterns in your relationships that you cannot explain and cannot seem to change. The persistent sense that life is moving along a familiar groove that you did not consciously choose and do not know how to exit. Jung believed all of this was the unconscious doing what it does when its contents are not brought into awareness. Running the show from below, directing the life, and the person experiencing this, calling it fate. Now here is the part that changes everything. The ego, that diligent organizer of daily experience, that careful manager of what gets acknowledged and what gets held back, does not maintain its full operational capacity indefinitely. It runs on energy, psychological energy that depletes across the course of a day of continuous functioning. And as evening comes, as the tasks of the day are completed and the body slows and the stimulation of the external world begins to recede, the ego's resources run low, not dramatically, not in a way that produces any visible signs of distress. Simply, the tight continuous management that it exercises over the boundary between consciousness and the unconscious gradually loosens. The filter thins, and in the space created by that thinning, in the transition between the managed state of daytime functioning and the unmanaged state of sleep, the material that has been waiting below begins, for the first time in the day, to move. Not loudly, not with the clarity of a conscious thought or the legibility of a rational argument, but in the form of a feeling that rises in the chest without an obvious cause. A memory that surfaces without being summoned, an image, not quite visual, more like an impression, that carries a quality of emotion that does not quite match what the day seemed to contain. An inexplicable unease in a body that should, by any logical measure, simply be tired. Jung believed these signals were not noise. They were not the byproduct of fatigue or the random firing of a mind winding down. They were messages from the part of the mind that had been waiting all day for the filter to thin enough to allow communication. From the accumulated material of everything that was experienced but not fully processed. From the aspects of the self that the daytime, with its relentless forward movement, its demands, its structured social performance, had not had room to acknowledge. And the question Jung spent his career exploring was not whether these messages existed. He had seen them, documented them, traced their influence across the lives of the hundreds of people he worked with over decades. The question was what a person did with them, whether they were noticed or dismissed, whether they were received as the meaningful communications they were, or brushed aside as the irrelevant static of an exhausted mind. Because what you do with these signals in the minutes before sleep, whether you turn toward them or away from them, determines something that most people never realize is being determined at all. It shapes the unconscious material you carry into the night, which shapes the state you emerge from in the morning, which shapes the day that follows, which, repeated across enough nights, shapes the life. There is a specific experience that most people have had without knowing what it was. You go to bed after a day that was, by any reasonable standard, fine. Nothing went seriously wrong. Nothing catastrophic occurred. The day was managed, the obligations were met, the performance was adequate. And yet, lying in the dark in the space between wakefulness and sleep, something surfaces. Not a specific worry, not a thought you can point to and name, something more diffuse than that. A heaviness that does not correspond to anything on the day's ledger. A quietness that has a different quality than simple tiredness. A feeling almost pre-verbal, almost beneath language that something has been missed. Something that was present during the day, but never attended to. Something that waited patiently while everything else demanded priority, and is now, in the only available quiet, making itself known. Jung would have recognized this experience immediately, not as a problem, not as something to be explained away or managed back into silence, as the unconscious doing exactly what it was designed to do, using the thinning of the ego's filter at the end of the day to communicate what the day itself did not have room to acknowledge. The person who dismisses this, who reaches for the phone, turns the television back on, fills the quiet with input until sleep finally overtakes them, is not doing something wrong exactly. They are doing what the culture around them has consistently modeled and normalized. But they are also, in that reaching for distraction, missing something. missing the moment when what was carried unexamined through the day had the clearest opportunity to become visible. And so it goes back down, unacknowledged, unprocessed, added to the accumulation, carried into sleep in its raw, unexamined state, to surface again tomorrow night, and the night after that, growing slightly heavier with each passing, until the weight of it is simply what life feels like. And the person living it calls it fate. Jung identified what he called the shadow as the central figure in this process. The shadow is not, as many people assume when they first encounter the concept, the evil or shameful parts of a person. It is more ordinary than that. And more important, the shadow is the collection of everything that has been excluded from conscious identity, not because it is necessarily bad, but because it did not fit. Did not fit the image you maintain of yourself. Did not fit what was expected or rewarded in the environments you grew up in. Did not fit the role you have been performing in the various systems, family, professional, social, that structure your daily life. Anger that was not allowed, grief that was not timely, ambition that was considered inappropriate, need that was considered weakness, fear that was considered unacceptable, qualities that were discouraged before they could develop into anything legible. All of this goes into the shadow. Not permanently eliminated, simply excluded from the version of yourself you consciously identify with and present to the world. And what Jung observed, with a consistency that he found both significant and sobering, was that what goes into the shadow does not stay quiet. It finds expression anyway. Not in the forms the person would choose if they were choosing consciously. In the forms that are available to material, operating from below the level of conscious awareness. In the disproportionate reaction to a minor provocation that seems to arrive from nowhere. In the recurring pattern of relationship dynamics that the person cannot explain and cannot seem to exit. In the specific quality of the heaviness that arrives on Sunday evenings or in the quiet after accomplishment or in the dark before sleep. The shadow is not trying to cause damage, it is trying to return. To be acknowledged. To be integrated. To be brought from the place where it was stored without consent back into the conscious life where it can be metabolized rather than continuing to influence from below. And the minutes before sleep, when the ego's management is at its lightest, when the filter is at its thinnest, are among the few moments in an ordinary day when the shadow can get close enough to consciousness to be heard. If anyone is listening, what does it actually mean to pay attention to the minutes before sleep? Not in the sense of a technique, not in the sense of a practice that requires equipment or expertise or a significant restructuring of your evening. In the most fundamental sense. What does it mean to turn toward what is present in that transition? To receive what the unconscious is attempting to communicate, rather than filling the space with something that ensures the communication cannot arrive. Jung's answer was simpler than most people expect. It begins with stopping. Not stopping in the sense of doing nothing. Stopping in the sense of ceasing to add new input to a mind that has been receiving input continuously since it woke. Ceasing to fill the available space with content that keeps awareness directed outward, toward screens, toward noise, toward the endless stream of information that modern life has made perpetually available and that most people have learned to treat as the natural habitat of a waking mind. And in the stopping, in the space that opens when the continuous inflow of external stimulation pauses, simply noticing what is already there, what has been there all day, what waited through every task and every conversation and every moment of managed forward movement for a space quiet enough to be felt. Jung did not call this meditation exactly. He did not call it prayer or journaling or any of the named practices that culture has developed around the idea of inner attention. He called it something simpler. Consciousness. The act of bringing something that has been operating below awareness into the light of awareness. Not to analyze it. Not to judge it. Not to immediately convert it into a problem to be solved or a task to be added to tomorrow's list. Simply to see it. To acknowledge it as real. To say, internally and without performance, this is what is present in me right now. And in that acknowledgement, In that moment of genuine inner honesty, something shifts. Not dramatically, not immediately in a way that produces any visible result, but at the level where the unconscious operates. Because the unconscious, Jung believed, responds to being seen. Not in a mystical sense, in the practical, psychological sense that material which has been brought into conscious awareness is no longer exclusively underground. It no longer has to find indirect expression through the disproportionate reaction, the recurring pattern, the inexplicable heaviness of certain mornings. It has been met at the surface. And meeting at the surface changes its relationship to the depths. There is a specific quality of honesty that this practice requires. And it is different from the kind of honesty most people are practiced at. The kind of honesty most people exercise, about themselves, about their lives, about how they are doing, is a social honesty. It operates in the context of an audience, real or imagined. It accounts for how the acknowledgement will be received. It shapes the admission to what feels safe to admit. It selects from the full range of what is actually true the portion that can be expressed without producing consequences that feel unmanageable. This is not dishonesty exactly. It is the ordinary calibration that social life requires. But it is not the kind of honesty that the minutes before sleep are asking for. The honesty that Jung believed was transformative. The honesty that could genuinely change the relationship between a person and their own unconscious was something more radical than the social version. It was the honesty of what is actually present, before it has been edited for audience, before the ego has decided which parts are acceptable to acknowledge and which need to be held back. The feeling that is present, not the feeling that is appropriate, not the feeling that makes sense given the day, not the feeling that the person wishes were present, but the actual unedited, sometimes inconvenient feeling that is there when everything else goes quiet. This is what Jung meant when he described the unconscious as speaking in feeling rather than language. Not because feeling is primitive or pre-linguistic, but because feeling, when it is felt, before it has been translated into socially acceptable language, carries information that the translation always loses. The specific quality of the unease that arrives on evenings that should be fine, the particular texture of the loneliness that can be present even in the midst of genuine connection. The precise character of the tiredness that is not physical, that sleep does not touch, because it is the tiredness of performing a version of yourself that requires continuous maintenance. These feelings are not random, they are accurate. They are the unconscious's report on the state of the actual self. Not the performed self, not the managed self, not the self that got through today adequately, the actual self. And the minutes before sleep are among the few moments in ordinary life when the report can be received without interference. Jung paid close attention to what he called the last image of the day. Not the last visual image, the final frame of the television program, or the last scroll of the social media feed. The last inner image. The felt sense of yourself and your life that is present in your mind as consciousness begins to yield to sleep. He believed this inner image, whatever its specific content, functioned as a kind of template, a background against which the unconscious would conduct its nighttime processing, a baseline that the dreaming mind would use as its starting orientation, and therefore a significant determinant of the psychological state in which you would wake the following morning. Think about what this means practically. If the last inner image you carry into sleep is the image of someone who is behind, who is not enough, who is always catching up to a standard that recedes as fast as they approach it, then the unconscious will spend the night processing from within that frame, reinforcing it, elaborating it, embedding it more deeply into the automatic assumptions that shape how you interpret and respond to experience. And you will wake into a day that feels from its very first moments like a continuation of that frame. Not because the day has already produced evidence for it, because the frame was already in place before the day began. This is not theory. This is the mechanism by which psychological patterns perpetuate themselves across time in ways that seem to have nothing to do with choice or effort or the conscious intentions of the person living them. The person tries to change during the day. They set different goals, think different thoughts, attempt different behaviors. But at night, Without awareness, they carry the same inner image into sleep, and the unconscious, loyal to what is familiar, continues generating the same baseline state. And the person wakes to find themselves again inside the same psychological reality they were trying to leave, and calls it fate. Jung's understanding of this mechanism was not pessimistic. He was not saying that the pattern cannot change. He was saying something more specific and more useful. That genuine change, the kind that reaches the level where the pattern actually lives, cannot happen only at the level of conscious effort during waking hours. It has to reach the material that is being processed at night. And to reach that material, it has to pass through the transition, through the minutes before sleep, through the moment when what is carried into the unconscious for the night is either the same unexamined accumulation as always, or something that has been, even briefly, even imperfectly, brought into the light of conscious awareness first. This is where the practice becomes concrete, not in the sense of a rigid structure or a prescribed set of steps, but in the sense of a direction that is available to anyone willing to turn toward it. In the minutes before sleep, not immediately before, not in the final seconds of consciousness, but in the quiet period when the day has ended and sleep has not yet arrived, you do something very simple. You stop adding, you stop filling the space with new content, you turn off what is external, and you turn toward what is internal. And then you notice. Not searching, not analyzing, not trying to produce a particular kind of inner experience, simply noticing what is already present. What is the quality of this moment? Not what should it be. Not what would I prefer it to be. Not what does it say about me that it is this rather than something else. What is it? If what is present is unease, if there is a tightness somewhere that the day did not account for, you do not immediately try to resolve it or explain it or convert it into a task. You simply acknowledge it. This is here. If what is present is a sadness whose origin is not immediately clear, if there is a weight that arrived sometime during the day without a legible cause, you do not immediately search for the source or argue with the feeling or remind yourself of reasons it should not be there. You simply acknowledge it. This is here. If what is present is a sense of incompleteness, not about specific tasks undone, but something more diffuse, the feeling that something important was missed or overlooked or did not receive the attention it needed, you do not immediately generate a plan for tomorrow. You simply acknowledge it. This is here. Jung believed this acknowledgement, this simple, non-judgmental act of allowing what is present to be seen as present, was more psychologically transformative than almost any active intervention. Because it changes the relationship between consciousness and the unconscious at the most fundamental level. It says, to whatever is waiting below, that the door is open. That what has been stored does not have to find indirect expression. That what has been waiting does not have to wait indefinitely. That the accumulated material of an unexamined life can begin, gradually and at its own pace, to move through the place where it is being acknowledged, rather than past the place where it is being avoided. The change that results from this practice is not the change most people imagine when they hear the promise embedded in this video's title. They imagine something more dramatic, a revelation, a breakthrough, a morning that arrives clearly different from all the ones that preceded it. What actually happens is quieter than that, and in its quietness, more durable. You notice, after some weeks of this practice, that the specific heaviness of certain mornings has become less consistent, not gone, not permanently resolved, less automatic, less present as the default background against which the day begins. You notice that certain reactions, the ones that used to arrive with an intensity that seemed disproportionate to what produced them, have developed a small but perceptible delay, a fraction of space between the trigger and the response that was not there before. Enough space to notice what is happening before you are already inside it. You notice that the quality of your inner life during the day has changed slightly, not because the circumstances of the day have changed, because the accumulated weight of unprocessed material that used to be present beneath every moment of daily experience has begun, slowly, incrementally, incompletely but genuinely, to lighten. Because some of what was stored there has been acknowledged, and acknowledged material moves differently than unacknowledged material. It does not disappear, but it no longer has to shout from the basement. It has been heard at the door. And the energy that was previously consumed by its shouting, by the indirect expressions of the accumulated unconscious weight, becomes available for something else. For the actual experience of the actual life that is actually happening, rather than the managed performance of a life organized around keeping certain things below the surface. Jung wrote, near the end of his life, about what he had come to believe mattered most. Not the theoretical framework, not the clinical observations, not the decades of careful documentation of the patterns he had seen repeat themselves across hundreds of lives, something simpler than all of that. He believed what mattered most was the relationship a person had with their own inner life. Not the relationship they performed, not the spiritual vocabulary or the psychological awareness or the ability to describe their inner world in sophisticated terms. The actual relationship. Whether they were willing to be honest with themselves in the quiet moments when honesty was available. Whether they were willing to receive what the unconscious communicated rather than filling every available space with something that prevented the communication from arriving. Whether they were willing to acknowledge what was actually present, rather than insisting on what should be present, what they wished were present, what would be more convenient, or more flattering, or more consistent with the image they maintained. This willingness, simple, unglamorous, requiring no special knowledge or technique or talent, was what Jung believed separated the people who changed from the people who continued to call their patterns fate. It is available to you tonight, in the minutes before sleep, when the day is over and the roles have temporarily fallen away and the external world has for a few quiet minutes stopped demanding your attention. In those minutes, simply notice what is there. Name it if you can. Feel it if language is not yet available. Acknowledge it without judgment, without immediately converting it into something actionable, without performing anything for anyone including yourself. Simply be honest with what is present. That honesty, practiced night after night, is what changes the background image. Not to something false or forced or artificially positive, to something more true. And a life lived from something more true, from a self that has been allowed to be seen in the quiet moments, acknowledged in the dark, received without judgment in the space between one day and the next. That life cannot help but change direction, quietly, gradually, in ways that accumulate over time into something that looks, from the outside, like transformation, but that feels, from the inside, like something simpler, like finally coming home to yourself, one night at a time. If something in this reached you in the specific way that recognition feels different from simply understanding, leave one word in the comments that describes what you have been carrying into sleep without naming it, because naming it tonight is how it begins to change.